APIA Nevada is a grassroots nonprofit organization that advocates for policies empowering everyday Asian Pacific Islander Nevadans. Nevada is home to a growing APIA community, accounting for 1 in 10 voters. We are One APIA Nevada. Concili Incorporated is Nevada's premier Democratic campaign firm, fighting for progressive issues and candidates for over a decade, and proud sponsor of Battle-Born Progress.
This episode of Out in Front brought to you by
Concili Inc., Nevada State Education Association, One APIA Nevada, Silver State Voices, and Stefan and Marta Schmidt, as well as our episode sponsors, Save Lives Nevada and Washoe Education Association.
All right, welcome back, everyone, to Out in Front. My name is Annette Magnus, and I'm the Executive Director of Battle-Born Progress. Thanks all for joining us. We're excited for this fabulous episode with so many of our partners from around the country and around the state. So today we are going to be talking about all things Inflation Reduction Act. As you all know, I hope you know, the president signed that piece of legislation into law a little over a week ago. And most of our Nevada delegation voted in support of the Inflation Reduction Act, including Senator Cortez Masto, Senator Rosen, Congresswoman Dina Titus, Congresswoman Susie Lee, and Congressman Stephen Horsford. As usual, Congressman Mark Amodei was a no-show. And, we'll continue to hold him accountable for not supporting progressive values. But we have some amazing guests on the show tonight who are going to be talking about all things Inflation Reduction Act. This historic piece of legislation is going to have such a huge impact on Nevadans and our lives. We're going to go through some of the numbers in just a little bit on the healthcare pieces and what it means to Nevadans. But we're also going to talk about the climate pieces and what that means to Nevadans and Americans, as this bill is going to actually start to address the climate crisis in a real way. So we're very excited about that. So without further ado, I want to introduce our special guest. The first person, and I want to thank him for helping us come up with this show tonight, is Russell Coleman. He's the executive director of the Nevada Wildlife Federation. We also have Emily G. She is the vice president and coordinator of health policy for Center for American Progress. We have returning guest and sassy person who I'd love to be, Margarita George she's the executive director with Healthcare for America Now, HCAN. We work with them on all of our healthcare policy nationally and here locally. We also work with them on tax policy. And then Angeline, I'm going to butcher your last name, and I already know I am, so I apologize in advance. Tabalva? Did I get it right? Yes. Communications director for the Nevada Conservation League, and she's going to be here to talk about the climate pieces as well. I want to thank you all for joining us. Thank you for being here. MJ, I'm going to start with you. Tell us what this piece of legislation means, because it's historic. It's another promise kept by the Biden administration. And we have a lot to be thankful for over the last week and a half. We've got the Inflation Reduction Act passed. We also saw student loan debt finally addressed yesterday in a real significant way for millions of Americans. Talk to us about this historic week and what we've seen out of Washington, D.C.
Great. I'm happy to. It's great to be back. Great to be on with these colleagues. So I'll say a couple of overall things about the legislation. And, Annette, we've worked together for a long time. So, we really see almost all the provisions in this legislation, whether they are the climate, anti-pollution, carbon emission reduction, the prescription drug reform, the Affordable Care Act stuff, the tax reform. We see that all as having a lot of relevance for health, both the health of people and the health of the planet, two things that are inseparable from one another. So we're really pleased with what we've seen in this package. And a lot of things in this package are things that reverse trends, and that a lot of us have been working on for many, many years. And for a lot of these issues, they got to the bubbling point and finally made it into this package. And I'll just mention a few really important historical things that are in this package. And I know that my colleagues here are going to elaborate on this, but I'll start with the climate investment. It's a historic climate investment. It's the largest ever investment in Congress to combat climate change, $369 billion. So really an incredible investment, long overdue for sure. And it goes a long way toward helping to meet the president's goals to reduce emissions by half by 2030. One thing that we've been working on quite a bit with state partners and national partners, including Emily's organization, the Center for American Progress, which was a co-founder in the Lower Drug Prices Now Coalition, is enabling Medicare to negotiate for drug prices for the first time. That might sound crazy. It's crazy that we don't already negotiate, because we know other government agencies negotiate. Veterans negotiates, Medicaid negotiates. I mean, the federal government negotiates for copy paper and bullets and all kinds of things. It would only make sense that they would negotiate for lower prices in the largest buyer of prescription drugs in the nation, which is the Medicare program. But the industry has fought this for years. Huge historic victory to finally be able to secure negotiations in Medicare. Another big victory in Medicare for seniors is capping out-of-pocket costs. A lot of people don't know, for most of the time that Medicare has been around, there has been an unlimited amount that people could be asked to pay out of pocket for their medicines. One thing that happens when you get old, for those of you that are not old yet, I'm maybe closer than a bunch of other people. You have to go to the doctor. You get chronic conditions. You need medicine. You need more as you get older. And as you get older, your income is reduced. So at the same time that people are needing more affordable medicines, the cost of medicine keeps going up and people's income keeps going down. So really important measure. And then I'll just mention on the tax piece of this, and, at HCAN, we work on taxes and healthcare together, flip sides of the same coin. This bill raises taxes on corporations, really rich corporations making over $1 billion for the first time in well over a decade. The last time we raised taxes like this on corporations was back in 2010 when we passed the Affordable Care Act, and we taxed prescription drug companies, insurers, and medical device manufacturers to pay for the health insurance reform. So for most of the time between 2010 and now, we've actually been cutting taxes for rich people and corporations, actually been giving them breaks and loopholes and all kinds of things while the rest of us continue to pay what we owe. So this bill really does have some important historical accomplishments. It really reverses a couple of bad trends, like tax breaks for rich people and for corporations. And that's why I think it's really going to have a significant impact in people's lives.
I couldn't agree more. And the president said it best yesterday when he was asked about the student loan debt cancellation, is these corporations have gotten bailout after bailout, and it's time that real Americans actually get a bailout and get some help for the things that they need most, like medicine and prescription drugs and student loan debt and all of the things that they need, because that's going to also help improve the economy. When they do better, we all do better. Emily, I want to come to you. Obviously, like I said, big couple of weeks federally for the work that's getting done. We've seen a lot of really good, important legislation get done this summer, whether it's on gun violence prevention or healthcare now. The IRA is a big win for many healthcare issues, specifically, as MJ was talking about, and I'll get to the Nevada numbers in a second. But what is your favorite element of this legislation, and what is CAP celebrating about this historic moment?
That is a tough question because it's so hard to choose of all the really important things that are in this bill. But I would say my favorite thing about this bill is that it really does lower healthcare costs for working families. For seniors, they will see lower costs for prescription drugs, for vaccines, and people who buy insurance on their own through the marketplaces will also see lower costs for their premiums. And the bill does a number of different things to achieve this. MJ already talked about a lot of them, which is, for the first time, seniors will see an out-of-pocket cap. People who are diabetic and depend on insulin will no longer have to pay more than $35 a month to get that life-saving medication. There are, it will also hold drug companies accountable by forcing them to pay money back to the government for the Medicare program if they hike prices in excess of inflation. It gets that negotiation, which is historic. That's talked about a lot in the Beltway, but there are real tangible benefits for seniors that they will see even starting in 2023 with the insulin price cap. And then for people who buy insurance on their own, this bill builds on the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, by making coverage much more affordable. It opens up financial assistance to more middle-class families. Previously, people who made more than 4 times the federal poverty level did not have access to subsidies. So there was something called the subsidy cliff, which is sort of a fancy way of saying if you earn slightly more than above a certain threshold, suddenly you go from getting some help to no help at all. And so this burden particularly fell hard on large families, people who live in expensive areas like rural areas, and people who were near elderly, so people who had relatively high health costs, who might have been 62, 63, but weren't quite at Medicare age yet. And this is a huge boon for them. And for the first time, they saw financial help thanks to the American Rescue Plan Act that first introduced these subsidies. Those were set to expire at the end of this year. Prices would have gone up without the IRA, and also 3 million people would have been uninsured without the IRA. But the IRA helps preserve those gains and helps lower health insurance premiums for millions of people.
Yeah, and just for those watching at home, when we say the IRA, we're not talking about the Irish here. We're talking about the piece of legislation called the IRA. That's what we've been calling it, the Inflation Reduction Act. We're calling it the IRA. So not to be confused, because I know that everybody was like, what's going on there? So I do, Emily, and I'm going to stay with you, and MJ, if you want to hop in on this, you can as well. I want to read some Nevada-specific statistics on what the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, will do specifically for Nevadans, because I think it's really important. The first statistic is over 11,000 people with Medicare Part D enrollees in Nevada who experienced out-of-pocket costs over $2,000 in 2021 will now have their prescription drugs capped at $2,000 per year. So that's huge. Nevadans on Medicare will be protected from Big Pharma's arbitrary price hikes that raise drug prices faster than inflation. 80 prescription drugs will now have Medicare price negotiation by 2030. Over 22,000 Nevadans on Medicare will have insulin copays capped at $35 per month. And for someone who has, insulin dependent people in her family, that's huge. That's so important to so many Nevadans. And over 91,000 Nevadans will save monthly on health insurance premiums now with the Affordable Care Act. So, Emily, those statistics for Nevadans, and there's more that this bill does, so much more. And again, it also addresses the climate crisis for the first time in a really big way. Talk about what that means, not just for Nevadans, but for Americans overall with this plan. And obviously, this is just a step. We had an event on Monday with Congresswoman Susie Lee, and she even said it herself. This is just the beginning, because we have to continue to protect these programs from Republicans if they get in control, but we also have to continue to expand them.
Mm-hmm. And so I think it's important to remember here is, it's easy to quantify, relatively easy to quantify the numbers. Just to add one more, of those Nevadans who do have out-of-pocket costs above what will be the cap, $2,000, there are substantial savings there. There is no cap, as MJ said. So you could be spending, thousands of dollars in co-insurance and co-payments when you go to the pharmacy to pick up drugs that you need to survive. And on average, Nevadans who will benefit from this cap are spending, currently about $1,300 more than the cap. And so that there will be substantial savings for those families who use high-cost drugs in those seniors. But what I am really looking forward to, and I think, besides alleviating the financial pressure that seniors face for their drugs, is this will also improve access to healthcare. There are people who are facing burdensome costs, who are struggling to afford medication that they need to live their lives and go to work or care for their loved ones. But there are also people who forego medications, who ration insulin because it's too expensive. And, those aren't necessarily captured in the cost numbers, but those are real lives, and those are, quality of life that is harmed when people can't access the medication that they need or the healthcare they need. And so, I hope that this will not only lower costs, but will also enable people to get better access to medication that they wouldn't otherwise have.
MJ, Emily, I want to bring you both in on this because I think there's a couple really important tenets of this piece of legislation that, in my opinion, are not getting enough hype when it comes to the healthcare elements. So one of the things that I want to talk about is capping the amount of money families pay for health insurance. So it's setting a threshold, 150% threshold, to pay no more than 8.5% of their income towards coverage. In addition to that, it also addresses healthcare equity by expanding coverage for communities of color, which is gigantic in a state like Nevada. And it's eliminating premiums for low-wage workers. The act ensures no Nevadans with incomes at or below 150% of the poverty level, federal poverty level, buying their coverage on the marketplace will pay a premium. And it also cuts costs for rural Nevadans, which is huge because, we have 15 of our 17 counties are in rural communities. So that's going to be huge for a lot of people in this state. So talk about the equity piece of this bill and why it's so important. MJ, you want to start?
Sure. I mean, listen, we often in healthcare debates, we talk about sort of the financing and the coverage and this and that. But the reality is people of color have generally higher healthcare needs. They're more likely to face chronic disease. They're more likely to live in polluted areas. They're more likely to lack healthy food to eat. They're more likely to work in jobs where they can't get access to basic benefits like paid family medical leave and health insurance. And so the ability to get access to affordable health care that is really affordable, right? That means that it's there, it's reliable, they can get it. It is what Emily said, it's a fundamentally quality of life issue and an equity issue. And remember, all of this that we do, whether it's access to affordable prescription medicine or whether it's reasonable premiums or affordable premiums so that people can see their physicians regularly, it is all about preserving people's lives. Right? Like when we talk about rationing, but let's think about what that is. What are the consequences of rationing? The consequences of rationing for a lot of people that take medicines that they need to keep them alive is a heart attack, right? It's a trip to the ER. It's death, right? I mean, we are living in the United States, the richest country in the world, and we have had people die because they cannot procure affordable insulin. So to me, the sort of heart of the matter, it's really a human rights issue, right? It's an issue that no matter where you live, what kind of job you have, where your family is from, what color you are, what age you are, everybody in this country should have basic access to health care, not just as a matter of financing and economic security, but because that is what we need to live, right? That is how we stay healthy. That's how we stick around for years and years to take care of our children and our neighbors and our parents and our grandparents. So I just think it's really, when you sort of break it down into the real components of what's at stake, anybody who's on this call who has a parent that can't afford medicine and, but for the fact that they have children that can help them out, or has a kid with insulin dependent diabetes, or, has a neighbor that can't get a tooth pulled unless they go to their church and take up a collection. Like that's really day to day what this is about, and making a big dent in that, fighting an industry that frankly has profited for so many years off the pain and suffering of regular people who should have never been denied that medicine to begin with. So I just think it's super important. And for, one thing that I just want to mention, and I know Emily's going to be with me on this, is we had one other really important component in this bill that didn't make it into the final bill that we have been fighting on for a long time, and we're going to keep fighting on, and that's closing the Medicaid coverage gap in the 12 states, most of them in the South, right? So we literally have people in America that have been waiting for a dozen years to get basic coverage because politicians in their state don't want to implement the Affordable Care Act's Medicaid provision. It's really about nothing but politics. And so we don't have a choice. We have to keep fighting for these things because it's a basic matter of equity, but it's also a basic matter of equal human rights for everybody who lives in this country.
Absolutely. Emily, I want to talk, because we're going to move into the climate portion next. I want to talk about the nexus between how decarbonization and the environmental elements in the Inflation Reduction Act intersect with improving people's health, because you have to have a healthy climate. You have to have a good climate to be able to keep yourself healthy. And we disproportionately see this impacting communities of color, like MJ was just saying. So what is the nexus, and why is it so important that these two elements were together in this bill?
So healthcare costs are a big problem, and I think the Inflation Reduction Act is going to do a lot to help get people better access to healthcare. To add zero premium plans that give them, free access to vaccines, zero cost sharing for annual wellness visits, and to prescription drugs. But healthcare is just one part of health. Our ability to attain our full health potential depends on the conditions where we live, where we work, and where we play. And taking care of the environment, and making sure that we address climate change to prevent things like deaths from extreme heat, from pollution, from water that's not clean or air that's not clean, is really important to ensuring that everybody, including in vulnerable communities, can attain their full health potential. So a few of the elements, and there are many in this bill that would help improve these conditions in which we live are, for example, the tax credits that people can receive for switching to cleaner energy in their own homes. So buying appliances that, for example, electric stoves instead of a gas stove, you could swap out, water heaters that use cleaner forms of energy. There are credits there for electric vehicles. And so, collectively, all of this will help the United States switch to cleaner forms of energy, which then reduces indoor air pollution from burning gas stoves, burning fossil fuels in our own home to cook dinner or boil water, as well as helping make our planet a better place and preventing the deaths and health conditions and chronic conditions that get exacerbated because our air is not as clean as it should be.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So with that, I want to bring in Russell, because we're going to talk more about the clean energy pieces of this and the environmental pieces of the Inflation Reduction Act. Russell, welcome back to the show. Let's begin by talking about what the Nevada Wildlife Federation does and who you all are and the good work you do in the state of Nevada.
So the Nevada Wildlife Federation was founded in 1951, which makes it one of the oldest conservation-based organizations here in the state. And our official mission statement is the Nevada Wildlife Federation works to provide Nevada with abundant wildlife that freely roams across a healthy sagebrush ecosystem for all Nevadans to enjoy, specifically for outdoor opportunities. But in the 21st century, our top priorities have been addressing Nevada's climate crisis, helping reform the oil and gas leasing process on federal public lands, and identifying and conserving wildlife migration corridors.
Absolutely. And we've worked with you on so much of that, and we'll keep working with you on all of that. So I just want to acknowledge out of the gate, no bill is going to be a one size fits all. That's not how legislation works. That's not the reality of actually getting good legislation passed. Our democracy kind of works at a slow pace. And so getting a bill like this done is historic, even though it doesn't address every single thing in the climate crisis that we currently need to address, because there's a lot there. So this is a huge step forward, though. And I want you to tell us about how big of a step forward it is for the environment and how historic this is, because in my humble opinion, this is like FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt level programming we're talking about here, especially to address climate change. And again, it doesn't address every single thing. It probably no bill ever will, but it's a really, really good start in setting us on the right path.
Agreed. And to put it in my perspective of how I realized how historic this is, some of the provisions and items that are now law, people have been working on for 20, 30 years, in particular, the climate stuff and oil and gas reform. So this just wasn't, addressing last year's problems or 5 years ago problems. People have been really fighting their entire careers to get some of the things that we see here in the IRA across the finish line. So in my opinion, that's what makes it truly historic. And, everyone that has worked on this legislation, all but gave up on it. And then all of a sudden it seemed like in a moment's notice, it was back in play. And so this was a hard fought roller coaster victory for everyone involved in this.
Absolutely. I may have had my own doubts on this bill a time or two over the entire month of July, actually the whole summer. I may have talked to MJ about that several times and my doubts about getting this done, but I was pleasantly surprised. I love when I'm wrong. So there will be investments of billions of dollars across the country for environmental conservation and protection. How will this impact the state of Nevada? I've talked about the numbers on the healthcare front, but what are we looking at in terms of the environment here?
Yeah, I mean, I could probably talk for an hour just on that topic alone. But, the two things I did want to flag was, how environmental justice will be addressed and how that affects Nevada, and then just how, people who use our public lands here in Nevada are going to benefit from this bill. So to touch on the environmental justice aspect of this, there's essentially two programs earmarked for $3 billion each. The first one being the Neighborhood Access and Equity Grant Program. And this is funding that I think will really help underserved communities by providing not only hiking trails and bike lanes, but installing sound barriers across highways and downgrading highways to be more friendly to the urban environment and housing communities. But really, a lot of the funds help by reconnecting communities that are currently divided by existing infrastructure barriers and mitigate negative impacts to transportation or construction projects within the disadvantaged, underserved communities. So I think it really opens up these urban areas that have historically been underserved by providing clean transportation energies to other parts of the city that have been non-existent. Hopefully this funding will correct that. And then the other bucket that is also earmarked for $3 billion is the Environmental and Climate Justice Block Grants. And this will go through the Environmental Protection Agency to fund community-led projects in underserved communities and help build community capacity building centers to address disproportionate environmental and public health harms related to pollution and climate change. We all know that more times than not, underserved communities are the first ones and are hit hardest by climate change. And so that's $6 billion between those two grant programs just focused on addressing that problem.
Thanks for that, Russell. We'll come back to you in just a second. So, Angeline, I want to bring you in. The Nevada Conservation League has been working on this for a long time. Y'all did a lot over the summer to help get this passed. The IRA is projected to reduce greenhouse gas emissions significantly by about 40% of the 2005 levels. How exactly are we going to accomplish that? And how does the Biden administration hope to get that done?
Yeah, so I think in this bill, and we've sort of talked about a lot of the tax credits that we're going to implement surrounding clean energy. So cleaning up the power sector is just going to be the first linchpin to decarbonizing the economy and other sectors, including transportation, buildings as well, that are increasingly going to rely on electricity to meet their power needs. So the investments in the IRA, especially those new and extended tax credits for clean energy, it's going to aim to reduce, like you said, a net 40% of those reductions by the year 2030, which actually isn't so far away. So clean energy is going to be a huge part of that. So the clean energy tax credits, we're talking about these being the key driver of decarbonization and lower consumer energy costs in the IRA's long-term extension and expansion of the tax credits. So we have tax credits for investment and production tax credits for solar and wind energy through 2024, and also establishing new technology neutral investment and production tax credits for all zero carbon electricity generation technologies. We also have tax credits that are coming in to get those solar tax credits back up to 30%. And those are going to be for the next 10 years. Fingers crossed we get a plan to make those permanent instead of like having to renew them again and again. But Nevada is also home to the largest solar industry in the nation. So we have over 300 sunny days per year. So we might as well take advantage of that in a way that contributes to a better environment and our economy as well. The other ways we'll clean up our air and climate pollution include clean transportation, making sure that folks can access and afford clean pollution-free vehicles, whether those are new vehicles or used vehicles. So the IRA is going to provide those tax credits again for about $7,500 off the purchase of a new EV, and then $4,000 off purchase of a used EV. And then I know Emily had mentioned before, but those tax credits for clean buildings and homes that are going to be good for folks' health, but make sure families can transition to cleaner appliances that are going to clean up our air too.
Angeline, one of the things I think that's most important for the state of Nevada, and I know we've seen specifically Senator Cortez Masto talking a lot about this and the governor over the past week or so, is the way that this is going to address drought relief. As many people who are watching this know, whether you're in Northern Nevada or in Southern Nevada, we're in a drought situation. We have been for decades now. And it's a huge problem, and it's part of the climate crisis. And so I think one of the most important pieces of the Inflation Reduction Act for Nevada is the drought relief funding for Western states that Senator Cortez Masto worked so hard to bring home for us. What do these provisions include to help ensure that Southern Nevada doesn't run out of water?
Yeah, I don't think we can overstate how important it is we address what might become a crisis in Nevada when it comes to drought. Nevada is the driest state in the nation. So planning for the future of one of our most valuable resources is going to be critical. So when we think about the capacity of Lake Mead right now, when we came into this century, Lake Mead was essentially full, and now the total system's content is about 1/4 its capacity. So the Inflation Reduction Act, like you said, includes $4 billion in funding for the Bureau of Reclamation, specifically to combat Western drought, and that includes the Colorado River Basin and Lake Mead in particular. So as you all heard, the U.S. Department of Interior just announced that Nevada is going to face another cut in our annual water allocation, which is going to be by 8% from the Colorado River in 2023, even though Nevada uses less water than we have in the past, or less water than we even had 20 years ago. I think although this is going to be a critical opportunity for us to address drought, we are fortunate to have the Southern Nevada Water Authority, who we got to speak to this past Tuesday at a conversation we hosted. They foresaw this being a big issue, right? And we are where we are. The reason we still have water is large in part due to their leadership. Nevada has been not just a national leader on water conservation measures, but also a global leader as well. So those aggressive and comprehensive water conservation strategies that help extend the availability of our water resources are the real reason why we can even continue to have these conversations today, including recycling almost 100% of our water here. We have mandatory watering schedules, rebate programs for people switching to water smart landscaping. We passed the non-functional turf bill last legislative session. So I say that all to say that Nevada is prepared to make the sacrifices necessary to reduce water, but continue to be a role model and inspire the other basin states to implement those aggressive water conservation measures as well. And we're just looking forward to those investments from both the bipartisan infrastructure package and the Inflation Reduction Act to continue to support these really aggressive water conservation strategies we've already implemented.
Thank you for that, Angeline. We'll come back to you in just a second. So, Russell, I want to come back to you. How does investing in things like wildlife and wildlife corridors, which I wish I would have had a few weeks ago when I was in Joe Manchin's state and hit a deer, and conservation and the environmental impact, people being able to enjoy those things, especially after and still during a massive pandemic that we've been through? Why is an investment like this so critical in our environment?
So I think maybe I'll call it a silver lining that the pandemic really highlighted was how many people recreate on our public lands or discovered our public lands for recreation, as whether it's just to get out for a weekend, but personally, and I think I'm not the only one, public lands serve as kind of my mental reset button as well. And so it's vital that we have access to them and they're not covered in wildfire smoke or have no water when we do visit them. And these investments go to address that. Obviously the $4 billion for drought resiliency is going to help Lake Mead hopefully quite a bit, since boating is the number one activity here in the state for our outdoor recreation economy. And most of that does take place in Lake Mead. But there's also a lot of money dedicated to forest conservation, wildfire mitigation, that will help keep our forests, smoke-free, essentially. And I see that being a big part because I'm up here in Reno, and I think anyone who does live in Reno can tell you last year was not the time to enjoy our public lands, just because most of the time it was unhealthy to breathe the air inside and outside of your house. And so what the IRA really does is help fund some of those mitigation efforts, whether it's forest thinning, which I did attend the Tahoe Summit with our Nevada and California delegation last week, and the Caldor fire that kind of came through South Tahoe last year. Forest thinning did help prevent a lot of homes from being burned, and when it's done responsibly, could be a very useful tool for land managing agencies. But something that I see is overlapping quite a bit between helping people get outdoors and the provisions here is the oil and gas reforms. And I really think that's going to open up a lot of possibilities for Nevadans to recreate on our state's land. So again, it's I definitely don't want to get too much into the weeds here, but this bill now gets rid of non-competitive leasing for oil and gas. And so to kind of quickly explain that, if the Bureau of Land Management opens up a oil and gas lease sale and it doesn't get bid on because it's all an auction style type of process, it then goes to non-competitive leasing. So an oil and gas company could bid on that for $1.50 an acre. And this last summer, the top 26 largest oil and gas companies profited $90 billion, and they're still buying land for $1.50 an acre. So that gets rid of that, which is how most of the land is sold for fossil fuel extraction here in the state. And now that that is no longer possible for oil and gas companies to do, that has opened up millions of acres of public land for us, because once land is tied to oil and gas leasing, the BLM will just prioritize that specific activity and will no longer do conservation or wildlife habitat improvement because it's now leased. And so, now that we've kind of gotten rid of all of the bad provisions that our oil and gas companies have been doing for 100 years or so, I think that's going to increase funding to our state, but also open up land that was traditionally locked up through oil and gas leasing.
Thank you for that, Russell. And just a reminder for those at home watching, whether you're on Twitch, Twitter, YouTube, you name it, Facebook, share this with your friends. We want them to be a part of the conversation. So share this on your social media now. We're also live tweeting this, so make sure you go on and retweet from all of our guests. We want to get this information about the Inflation Reduction Act to as many people as possible. Also, if you have questions, now's the time to put them in the chat. We're going to get to our questions for all of our panelists in just a few minutes, so make sure you put them in the chat. We're also going to put 2 articles. Richard Gilroy, one of our longtime viewers who watches every week with us, shout out to Richard. He sent me 2 really great articles to include in the chat tonight. One is about the record rain that has been obviously hitting the Southwest and parts of California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, and why that's actually not a good thing, because when you have burn scars and when you have drought-stricken areas, it actually creates more havoc when you have this much rain. But in addition to that, also on the water crisis, and Angeline just talked about this, why having a lawn is no longer a good idea, and why having useless ornamental grass in the desert is totally useless and a waste of water. So read those articles. They're really good on this topic. And it also is important from the previous conversation we had a few weeks ago on the climate crisis. Angeline, I want to bring you back in to kind of close up this section, and then we're going to go to some additional questions from the audience. You know, of course, we talked about this when we started this segment of the Inflation Reduction Act. The IRA alone is not going to solve the climate crisis. The climate crisis is huge, and there's so much to be done, especially for low-income communities, rural communities, communities of color. What do you think needs to be included in future legislation before Congress in order to achieve President Biden's climate goals, especially around environmental justice? And what can be done maybe here at the state level as well?
Yeah, I think with this bill, I think there were, a few components of this bill that we were already worried about, where we had to make some deals around. And, while this legislation is critical to building a clean energy future that's safer, healthier, and more just for all, it also includes potentially harmful provisions that could continue or perpetuates our nation's dependence on fossil fuels specifically, and how this is related to environmental justice is it subjects frontline communities, especially the communities that are going to be in the Gulf of Mexico near oil and gas infrastructure, to further pollution and harm. So I think with this bill, these provisions are not consistent with our climate and our justice goals. And so in the years ahead, we're going to keep fighting to fight to block their implementation and to minimize the impact that they're going to have on these communities, because we understand how the legacy of environmental justice really do affect these frontline communities. And we're going to, continue to fight for these equitable climate actions on a lot of fronts by pushing bold executive action and continue progress in states and Congress. And I think there's already been some rumors about Biden moving forward with some administrative executive action on, those components of the bill. And I think more so than just what we're going to continue to do in Congress but we need to really measure the impact that these bills are going to have on our communities. And so we have to make sure that when the bill funding gets to our states, they are doing what they are intended to do, not just supporting the programs, but making sure the funding meets the communities that they were intended to reach and honor those Justice 40 initiatives that we had talked about for a while.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Angeline. MJ, before we go back to the audience, I'm going to come back to you and Emily for a second. MJ, starting with you. I want to really kind of emphasize this before we move to audience questions. But, one of the provisions of this bill that I don't think is being talked about enough are the tax provisions. You had, people like Adam Laxalt out there running their stupid mouths about, oh, it's not, it's going to tax people. It's going to tax poor people. No, it's not. It's not going to do that. And so can you just tell me overall, how much does this make the tax system just a little fairer and make the ultra rich pay their fair share and start playing by the rules that the rest of us do? And what is that going to look like for your average Nevadan?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll start by saying this. Anybody who can hear me on this call, if you do not make $400,000 or more, you are not going to face any additional taxes as a result of this bill. So the only people that have to worry about additional taxes are people that make $400,000 a year or more, which tend to be people that can generally afford to pay a little bit more tax. And they also tend to be the people that have been avoiding taxes and gotten the most tax breaks over the last decade, including from the Trump tax law. And for people that are worried about the deficit, listen, part of the reason we have a deficit is because the Trump tax law increased the deficit by $1.7 trillion and largely gave that money to the richest people and corporations. It slashed corporate tax rates. So listen, I think it's one thing that's important to remember is that this economy works best when we all contribute to it, right? So corporations, rich people, the richest 1%, there should be a tax system in this country that applies one set of rules to everybody. But unfortunately, that's not what we've had. We've had a two-tiered system in which most everybody, regular working folks, pay their fair share of taxes. And the richest people in the country, billionaires, which is a growing number of people in our country, millionaires, affluent people, and corporations, particularly the really rich ones, right? 55 corporations you've heard of, FedEx, Amazon, Nike, corporations that are making record profits during the pandemic in 2020 paid zero in federal taxes, right? So it's really about the structuring an economy and having a tax system that applies one set of fair rules to everybody, getting everybody to pay what they owe, because tax funding is essential for basic services, right? So when you think about the things that people in Nevada care about, maintaining public lands, roads, cleaning up pollution, schools, all the sort of basics, right? Safe airports, public safety, all those things are funded with taxpayer money. And in a democracy, we pool that money and then we deploy it to best serve people, the people that live in that country. So I think a couple of really important things in this bill, and I totally agree with you, by the way, as you know, my secret love is taxes, and I've worked on taxes for a long time. I think the tax provisions are really underplayed and they're really important. For 40 years, this country has operated under trickle-down economics, right? The old school trickle down. We just give more people at the top more stuff, and eventually it'll trickle down. That has not worked for us. Most of it does not trickle down. Most of it stays stuck up there. And so the tax provisions in this bill really reverse that trend. So they increase taxes on corporations, 15% minimum tax on corporations, rich corporations making over $1 billion. It's about 150 corporations, really important. A lot of these corporations, they're not making money on their own, right? Like Elon Musk has money. He's making money because he's got, Tesla. But last time I checked, Tesla was a car and consumers buy cars. Right? It's not like he doesn't owe anything back to pay back into the economy. So that provision really, really important. And in fact, that provision raises a lot of money to pay for some of the environmental provisions that the colleagues talked about in terms of the climate change provisions. I want to mention the surtax, the excise tax on stock buybacks. A lot of people don't know what stock buybacks are. By the way, if you don't know what a stock buyback is, there isn't any reason why you should, because most people in America don't own stock, right? Rich people, affluent people make most of their money off of financial assets like stocks and assets like that. Right. That is how they accumulate wealth. But, 50% of all stocks in America are owned by the richest 1% of the population, right? So half of all stock owned by the richest 1%. So, 90% of all stock is owned by the richest 10%. So if you're like, what the hell is a stock buyback? Of course, we wouldn't know because most of us are not in that category of people. But a stock buyback is when a publicly traded company buys their own stock back in order to inflate the share price or in order to compensate their executives. And usually the reason people do that, the reason corporations do that is because buying your own stock means that you don't have to pay taxes. It's one way to avoid taxes. The provision in this bill that assesses a very small excise tax, a very small charge, a 1% charge, just starts to get at this issue of concentrated wealth and wealthy people who essentially make all of their money through financial assets. When you make your money through assets, you don't pay taxes on it unless you sell the assets. It's really different than being a working person in this country where, you go to work, you get a paycheck every week. Every week they take taxes out of your paycheck. There's no way really to avoid that. Whereas rich people that are making most of their money off of things like stock buybacks, right, as shareholders in big corporations, they actually never have to pay taxes. And it leads to this system of concentrated wealth. So I think this bill is really important because when we're in a country where, 800 billionaires control over half the wealth in the country. Let me tell you, that's a pretty scary place to be. When you have people that are rich enough, I mean, the billionaires in this country aren't just rich enough to buy like yachts and airplanes and Twitter. They're rich enough to buy elections, right? We have rich billionaires in this country right now that are basically working together to buy the US Senate. That's mostly not going to be good for us. All of the policies that they want are in contradiction to the things that would actually be better for working families, like affordable health care, like public education, like so many other things. So I just really encourage people to think about the tax provisions, because all the things that we want in the future, if you're a senior and you want coverage for dental, vision, and hearing, we're going to have to pay for that. And there's no reason why we shouldn't, because there's plenty of money in America. The question is, how do we actually get rich people to pay their fair share? The last thing I'll say is a big piece of the tax reform in this bill involves the IRS and giving the IRS the resources and power to actually chase down people who avoid taxes, which tend to be pretty rich people, because the tax code is just all Swiss cheese. So the IRS enforcement provisions of the bill, incredibly important. A lot of times, and you'll hear people like Janet Yellen say this, we don't tax rich people. We don't have a wealth tax because we actually can't tell how rich wealthy people are. Like, we can't identify all of their wealth. So it's actually pretty hard. I know it's ridiculous. I feel silly saying it, but it's actually the truth. We can't identify how wealthy people are. And so we can't really tax them appropriately. So this bill starts to get at the idea that actually we should collect taxes in a way that is fair, and do so on rich people as well, and not let them get away with using loopholes to hide their wealth so that they never end up paying what average Americans pay for taxes.
Well, on that note, also Adam Laxalt whining about FBI agents may be the funniest thing I've seen all week.
Right, it's I've seen some of the conservative memes about, like, I mean, they're talking about IRS enforcement like there's like an army of darkness coming your way. Listen, if you're not a billionaire or you don't make over $400,000 and you don't have any need to hide anything on your tax return, or you're not trying to make use of some obscure loophole, you don't have anything to worry about, right? The people that have stuff to worry about are people that, frankly, are billionaires, millionaires, affluent people who in this country actually pay lower tax rates than teachers or firefighters or nurses. Those people should be worried because they might actually have to pay what they owe in taxes finally.
Yeah, anytime we can tax Elon Musk, it's a good day for me. Emily, I'm going to let you have the last word before we move to audience questions, because I want to just reemphasize this piece. I really do feel like the Inflation Reduction Act builds upon the Affordable Care Act, and it continues the work we started back in 2010 when we started our journey with the Affordable Care Act, and the good work that HCAN and others have done over the last decade to really get us to this moment, to continue that momentum and building. So what are the ways this builds upon the ACA, and where do we go from here, and how do we keep up this momentum?
I want to take a step back for a minute, because I think what we've been through in the past few years as a country has been tough and also remarkable in terms of healthcare coverage. We are, still in the midst of a pandemic, but, went through a lot of turmoil in 2020 where people lost jobs. Even people who were completely laid off, lost their income. Maybe their employer kept paying some benefits, but they were out of a job, at a grocery store or at or a retail store, or, serving food at a restaurant, or, teaching, being support staff at schools that were shut down. And I think the remarkable thing, particularly compared to what happened during the Great Recession when uninsurance spiked, is that we actually saw health insurance coverage stay steady. In fact, right now we are at the lowest uninsured rate ever in our country, just 8%, which is, remarkably low considering that we've been digging out of this public health and associated economic crisis, and are now in a much stronger place. But all that is thanks to the Affordable Care Act, because the AC is there when you need it, in multiple ways. One is that Medicaid is now available in most states except those that have refused to expand Medicaid to people who are under poverty. But if you, in the majority of states, if you are even a childless adult, you qualify for Medicaid simply because you aren't bringing in income. There's also an option for people who need to buy coverage on their own because they don't qualify for a public program like Medicare or Medicaid, or don't have insurance through their employer, and that is the marketplaces, also known as the Obamacare plans, right? And that is a lifeline for many families who were transitioning between jobs, or left school, or had a change of circumstances, had to move states because of the pandemic, and not being able to afford housing, or needing to care for people who needed, in their families, who needed a caretaker. And so thanks to the ACA, we saw people were able to maintain coverage, which then in turn means able to maintain access to healthcare that they need, medications that they need. And so what the Inflation Reduction Act does is help build upon those gains by extending these enhanced subsidies for marketplace coverage through 2025. So if you are someone who got a bump up in your financial help in 2021 or 2022, you will see that continue for the next few years. And hopefully, I hope, Congress will act again to extend that into the future. And then I think the Inflation Reduction Act also builds upon the spirit of the ACA, which says that people really need financial protection from catastrophic healthcare costs, and that wasn't something that that's not something that's traditionally been part of Medicare. As highly as people think of Medicare as being that protection for seniors, that helps seniors get the care they need, there was no out-of-pocket limit on what seniors could spend for drugs. So if you're someone who takes a lot of drugs or has really expensive drugs, say for cancer, you could be on the hook for a lot of money that comes out of your own wallet. And for the first time, seniors will finally have financial protection against catastrophic costs for prescription drugs. And seniors who are low income will actually see a lot of more financial protection too, because instead of having to pay your full deductible when it resets each January, your drug spending will be better smoothed out through the year, which enables you to better manage your budget and not take that huge hit at the first months of the year.
Yeah, thank you for that, Emily. I appreciate that. All right, let's move to some audience questions. If y'all have any other audience questions, put them in the chat now. Now's your time to shine. So we'll go to our first one. MJ, I'm going to give this one to you because I think you're going to appreciate it. We'll ask, how do we expect Big Pharma to respond to drug negotiations? And can they stall or sabotage this process and I'm just ad-libbing now, since they've tried to sabotage this whole thing from the beginning?
Well, the nicest thing that I can say about pharma is that they are remarkably consistent. So yes, they will absolutely continue to try to stall progress. They wrote the 2003 Medicare Modernization Act that forbade negotiations in Medicare to begin with. And their loss of that prohibition this time around, has left them smarting. They're not going to stop trying to subvert the process. So that's why when we wrote this legislation and we lobbied for it, we put in some specific provisions to make sure that pharma could not circumvent, right? Because a lot of this, we needed negotiations because pharma has monopoly power to set prices. We had to set up fair rules that would ensure that they would actually participate in negotiations. So I'll mention a couple of those. One is that pharma is required to negotiate drug prices on the drugs that HHS selects. If they don't negotiate drug prices, they will be fined with an excise tax. It's a pretty hefty tax, right? So they're going to negotiate. The reality is that Medicare is the largest purchaser of prescription drugs, and they actually have quite a lot of leverage, and they've had it for a long time but never used it. Two, every administration is going to be required to negotiate. So that means that after President Biden's administration, if we end up with a president that actually doesn't support negotiation and doesn't really give a gosh darn about lowering drug prices for people, they will not be able to opt out of negotiations. They're still going to be required to negotiate. So that's a really important provision that really ensures that we can have accountability. But in terms of what pharma will do, listen, we already know what they're going to do because it's the same thing they've been doing. They're going to seek to figure out how to raise their profits and inflate their profits in other ways. And we are going to have to continue to educate people. I will say pharma is not a particularly powerful messenger. People just don't believe them. because it's hard to believe corporations that would raise the price of insulin so high that people can't get access to it, and people's kids and grandparents end up dying because they can't get insulin, of all things, or they end up dying because they can't get cancer drugs. So yes, definitely expect pharma to be on some shenanigans. They're going to try to raise their launch prices. Again, it's nothing new. Launch prices are already ridiculously high, right? Everybody wants new drugs. Everybody loves innovation. But the truth is, new medicines can't help people if no one can afford them, right? So like we have to keep plugging away. And I think in terms of pharma, we should just expect them to be who they are and not be deterred in what we need to do, which is really implement the Inflation Reduction Act and continue to chip away at prescription drug reform so that it applies to more and more groups of people. We did a lot for folks in Medicare in this legislation. We need to move on and start lowering drug prices for people with private coverage.
And MJ, you can cuss on this show, so don't worry about that.
Okay.
You don't have to say gosh darn when it comes to the pharmaceutical company.
Being polite. You know, you could see that I had to think about it.
I know you had to like mentally edit yourself.
I was like, wait a minute, what do people who don't
edit yourself? We're in Nevada. You don't have to do that. Remember who we are. We're a hedonistic people.
It's a relief.
Emily, I want to come to you for this next question. Lisa says, as somebody with older parents, the cap is so helpful. Does this close the donut hole?
Yeah, so I guess so the ACA originally closed the original donut hole, which was there really was a gap in Part D coverage where your plan would give you some coverage, you would pay a deductible probably and a copay, some percentage or maybe $5 or $10 when you picked up your prescription at CVS or Walgreens or whatever. And then there was this hole where you were on the hook for the entire price of the drug. And then eventually, if you spent a lot of money, catastrophic coverage would actually kick in. The ACA fixed that so that beneficiaries don't owe through that whole gap, and the savings accrued are the order of millions. But there's still no protection until before the Inflation Reduction Act for people against catastrophic costs. So if you spend beyond a certain amount, you would still have to pay a good share of your drug spending, and then you could be spending literally tens of thousands of dollars. If you had a drug that costs tens of thousands of dollars, there's no limit on what you would pay out of pocket. So you might be having to pay 5%, for example, of that in the catastrophic phase. And so, for some people who use really expensive drugs, means there is no ceiling on the amount that you might pay per year to get the really basic medications that you need to thrive. And so, what this bill will do is say that when you add up all the out-of-pocket costs, that is deductibles or co-pays or co-insurance, so it might be that 5 or 10% of the drug that you pay, or 20%, or the $20 or $35 flat fee that you pay when you pick up your prescription at the pharmacy. That in total will be capped at $2,000 per year for seniors each year. And so your drug costs in any given year are capped at that amount. And then, of course, there still are low-income subsidies for people with incomes under a certain threshold to give them even greater protection from out-of-pocket costs.
Thank you for that, Emily. All right, Russell, I'm going to come to you for this next one. And I think it's an interesting question. And Angelina, I'm going to come to you for the last question, so you might want to check it before I ask it. There's a lot of confusion, I think, in the West or just in the United States generally about water policy, how our water policy got made in Nevada, where we got our acres per foot because, it was negotiated in the 1800s by somebody from Carson City who didn't know what Las Vegas was eventually going to be. So Diane asks, will the water department, or have they ever done a study about pumping water from states that are experiencing flooding and transporting it here to Nevada to be cleaned and used? And I think that's an interesting thought. It's a creative thought. I don't know if it would actually work or not. But, Russell, what are we looking at in terms of water preservation, water protection when it comes to Nevada as a whole?
So, just in terms of just the wildlife aspect, it doesn't take a whole lot of research to realize how many endangered or threatened fish species we have in the state because of our drought. And, it's the worst drought in 1,200 years. And, some of our smaller fish are already experiencing that. And the list goes on to identify those species. And I've also heard that idea being tossed around, in essentially importing water from, I would say, water-rich areas. I also have my doubts, and I just kind of remember when California tried to pump water from Owens Lake down to LA, and that was Californians helping Californians, and that was a long history of sabotage and back and forth legal battles. So I think it would take a monumental effort of collaboration for states to help each other out in that regard, because water and our water resources, in my opinion, is going to be the new gold in the next 50 years, and people are going to want to hold on to what they have in each state. And so, I would even propose, Nevadans and people moving to Nevada, realizing that we are essentially the driest state, and we need to start living as such. And that means conserving waters for lawns, implementing drought policy, and everything from planting native plants that have adapted to our state, instead of trying to build new golf courses for the influx of people coming to Vegas or Reno. And so I think it's going to be more, I would say, if I had to put my money on something, I would bet on us changing our culture as Nevadans and how we need to live with water resources, instead of essentially prolonging the issue of pumping in more water, because I don't think that's going to really fix our problem long term. And what does have a high probability of success is changing our culture, and that takes time. Anytime you change traditions, it's a long, slow process. And with the investments that the IRA has done here, I think that helps us monumentally in funding some of those big changes that are needed. But that would be my solution to our water issue. Is it's going to have to be a culture change in how we've traditionally used water, like it will never end. Similar to fossil fuels, there is going to be end date, and we can't keep spending it like it's an infinite supply.
Yeah, as Mark Twain said, water is for fighting and whiskey is for drinking. And that couldn't be more true in the West. As somebody who was born and raised here, we know that water and water politics, I mean, it was a whole class I took at UNLV. And it's something that all of us need to get a little bit smarter on. And I do think, based on Angeline's remarks earlier, Nevadans have done their part and continue to do their part. Now we need the states around us to start putting in their fair share as well, because California and Arizona love to use water like it's, there's no drought, and we have plethora of water, and that's not real. Angeline, I want to ask you the last question, because it literally, this week, I saw a tweet by Adam Laxalt, and it pissed me off so bad, because a man from Northern Nevada who has no idea what he's not even from Nevada, let's be real, he's from Virginia, illegitimate son of Pete Dominici. So this man tweeted, we should just go and desalinate water from Arizona, even though Arizona is a landlocked state, and there's a whole ass country between Arizona and the Baja where he would like to take that salt water from. So Adam Laxalt doesn't know geography, number one. Number two, Adam Laxalt doesn't know water policy and shouldn't be anywhere near an elected office. So with all that being said, Will asking for my friend Adam Laxalt, can we get desalinated water from Arizona? And I think the notion of even thinking about desalinization, whether it comes to Adam Laxalt doesn't believe in the climate crisis, Adam Laxalt doesn't believe in science, Adam Laxalt, I didn't even know he believed that there was a water crisis. Talk to me about that, Angeline, and these politicians who spout off this nonsense without actually, really investing in bills like the IRA, which he has said online he opposes this week.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I saw another story from KLAS saying that when they had reached out about this particular issue, he had absolutely no comment. So, that might just assume he has no solutions. But I think there's just, again, like that misconception about like Nevada's going to run out of water. And these historic lows are painting a really bleak picture for the future of Nevada's water supply. And I just want to tout again, Southern Nevada Water Authority's their water readiness, our water readiness. And I want to take from what we just spoke about on Tuesday with the Southern Nevada Water Authority General Manager, John Etzminger, who said, Southern Nevada is the most water secure in the desert because of our geographical location. We are upstream of the Hoover Dam, and we have the reliable facilities to ensure that the water gets delivered under any hydrological circumstance. And collectively, and he said this verbatim, we control our own future, and we're going to be okay. Which is just the best way to quell all of our anxiety about the future of our water supply in these coming years. And I think one of the ways that he is able to quell our anxiety about that is because SNWA has invested in water infrastructure, extremely important water infrastructure, which is the low lake level pumping station, which is the third intake. This would be better with a photo, but which is a low lake level water pumping station that allows Southern Nevada to still access water supplies even when the lake reaches a dead pool elevation, which would be the lowest it could be, where at that elevation, we no longer have hydroelectric power from Hoover Dam that cannot be created. But even at that dead pool level of 895 feet of elevation, we can still access water. So again, I just want to reiterate the leadership of Southern Nevada Water Authority, and also for Senator Cortez Masto, who called for the distribution of that drought funding, contingent upon the fact that these other basin states along the Colorado River, who also depend on that, just contribute their fair share to water conservation, and just implement those comprehensive conservation strategies, just like Nevada's done for the last few decades.
And then if anybody at home has access to Adam Laxalt, please encourage him and his staff to look at a map of Nevada and Arizona, and just look at where the water is, because that would be probably helpful if you're running for the United States Senate to know like where things are. Anyways, thank you all for joining me for this very important conversation about the Inflation Reduction Act. Anything else any of you want to add on this historic piece of legislation, or where we go from here? All right, here. Go ahead, MJ.
Where we go from here is, implementation. Passing a law is always a great thing, but you have to do quite a lot of work. And everybody who has worked on healthcare or climate change or you have to do a lot of work to actually implement the law. Some of the provisions of this law, like the Medicare negotiations, don't actually go into effect until years from now, right? 2023, 2026, 2023, 2024. So I just really encourage people to stay engaged. We can't pass laws in the United States Congress without the participation of real people in states. It's really people like the folks listening to this call. And we can't implement them either without your participation and your investment. So really just encourage people to stay in touch with Battleborn and your colleagues and organizations in Nevada to get plugged into the things that you can do to help us along the way, because we still have quite a lot of work to do. The other thing I would say in terms of pharma is a great organizer years ago, when I was a baby organizer, told me, listen, when your opponent is down, now's the time to kick him and make sure he stays down. That's kind of how I feel about pharma, right? Like they're sort of down. So what we need to do is build on that victory and continue to push them, right? Continue to hold them accountable and continue to move on and reform the rest of the healthcare system so that we can actually get affordable medicines for everybody, no matter where they live or what they look like or how much money they have.
Absolutely. Emily, and then Russell.
Thanks. I just want to say first, thank you for having me on. I think it's impossible to understate how big a deal, to overstate how big a deal this Inflation Reduction Act is, not only for healthcare and prescription drugs, but also for climate. That said, I think this is just the beginning. And I think what's really exciting about this, particularly as someone who lives in Washington, where there's just constant frustration with the Congress, is that it demonstrates that Congress, or at least 51 senators, are willing to stand up to big pharma and to big corporations who would have loved to keep all the money that they're avoiding paying in taxes. And this gives me hope for what more we could do if at least a majority of Congress is willing to stand up to special interests, and keep defeating big pharma. Could we lower drug costs for people in private plans to get their insurance through work? Is there more that we can do to ensure that taxes are even more fair? There's certainly more we can do to be protecting not just the environment, but the other conditions under which we live and live and work, whether that's sort of protections for workers like paid leave, and also childcare to support healthy moms and also healthy young children. So I think this hopefully will be a turning point in Congress's willingness to stand up for everyday people and not corporations.
Absolutely. Russell?
I would just like to flag that, I think a lot of our Nevada delegation deserves some thank yous on this legislation because, for instance, Senator Rosen and Congresswoman Susie Lee, their fingerprints were all over the oil and gas reforms that made it through the bill. And, there's already been mentioned Senator Cortez Masto's voice for climate here in Nevada was very critical in fighting for that drought funding. So, as the Nevada delegation, they definitely put the work in making sure this crossed the finish line with all the great things that we outlined tonight.
Thank you. Angeline, you want to add anything?
Yeah, last thing I'll say is just from this bill, we need to make sure we're still harnessing this optimism, this enthusiasm that we're getting from the passage of the IRA. Let's win this win. Let's be excited about this victory, and then use this to press for more action, for more power, for more transparency, for more justice. So this is the biggest action we've ever taken on climate, and it's just not going to be the last.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I want to thank my fabulous panelists for joining me tonight and sharing their insight and their wisdom on the Inflation Reduction Act. It is a historic moment for this country. And speaking of historic moments, we are going to be back next Thursday to talk all about the student loan debt relief that was just passed yesterday or implemented yesterday by the White House. We're very excited about it. And we want to talk more about what it does and does not do. And if you're mad about young people or anyone getting to pay down their loans or pay off their loans, and you've already paid off your loans, please stop, because everybody gets to succeed in this country. So we're going to talk more about that next week because I'm super excited about it. I don't have any student loans thanks to the Millennium Scholarship in Nevada. But I'm super excited for my friends who do, because now they're going to be able to pay them off faster or just pay them off completely. So join us next week live at 5 on our Battleborn Progress Facebook page, all of our other pages, Twitch, Facebook, Twitter, you name it, we're there, YouTube. Make sure you're following our pages, follow along. We also have Celebrate Progress coming up on September 7th. 6 p.m. at the Paiute Golf Course. We're going to be celebrating all kinds of amazing people from all over the state of Nevada. So you're not going to want to miss that. We'll put the link for tickets in the chat. It's still not too late to get your tickets to Celebrate Progress, so join us for that. Thanks, everyone. And thanks to our speakers for joining us tonight and staying a little bit over to answer the audience questions. We appreciate you, and we will see you next week. Have a great evening, everyone. Stay safe and healthy.